I'd like to invite you to find Lamentations chapter 3 this morning. Lamentations chapter 3. A title for this morning is Jeremiah's Remedy in Hopelessness. Jeremiah's Remedy in Hopelessness. And I'd like to begin today with an illustration about a place that many of you have heard about. Very few of us have probably actually been there. It is the Cape of Good Hope. What is interesting about the Cape of Good Hope is that wasn't its original name. The original name for the Cape of Good Hope was the Cape of Storms. And over time, what manifested was that if a person successfully navigated the storms of the Cape, they would find it to be a Cape of Good Hope. When I first read that, my thoughts immediately went to Lamentations chapter 3, for it's such a parallel illustration to the book of Lamentations. Lamentations chapter 1 and 2, God deals with the consequences of Israel's sin. Chapter 1, the storm of what we would call loss. It's the storm of loss, and God uses the description of loss with the hopes of bringing Israel back to himself. As we navigate into chapter 2, we find that God has a consequence not just of loss, but of effect, in which the consequences of Israel's sin affected the innocent in great abundance. And once again, he is beckoning to his people. If they would respond right and they would come back to the Lord, they would find hope in the midst of the consequences of their sin. But kind of in a sense, if we were to call chapters 1 and 2 the Cape of Storms, as we sail into chapter 3, we find the Cape of Good Hope. And it's right in the midst of this chapter that God, through his words, through Jeremiah, gives us a remedy in hopelessness. Allow your eyes to go to verses 1 through 17. We studied these verses last week, but by way of reminder, if you were to take verses 1 through 17 and you were to put one word next to these verses, the word that would be most appropriate is the word feelings. Because from verse 1 to verse 17, you hear, read, and see the feelings of Jeremiah. We say Jeremiah because verse 1 says, I am the man that has seen affliction. At this point in the letter, at this point in the poetry of Lamentations, he moves from saying, this is God's people's words. He ceases from speaking for the people to speak for himself. And so he begins to describe some of the feelings. In verse 2, he describes the feeling of darkness. He hath led me, brought me into darkness, but not into light. Down in verse 7, he articulates another feeling. He says in verse 7, he hath hedged me about that I cannot get out. He hath made my chain heavy. In verse 7, he's articulating this feeling that life is so difficult that when he looks ahead, he doesn't see a light at the end of the tunnel. He doesn't see as if there is any kind of hope of change. He says, listen, I just kind of feel hedged in. This is going to be my life. I found it interesting in verse 7, that last phrase, he hath made my chain heavy. I have heard people, and I have personally experienced in seasons of grief, that it feels like the lifting of one foot and the next foot is just heavier than normal. And in a sense, he says, I have been weighted down that the normal task of life just seemed to be more sluggish and harder because of the feelings and the grief that I bear. In verse 8, he articulates a third feeling. Also when I cry and shout, he shutteth out my prayer. Jeremiah says, I feel as if God is just so distant that my words, they don't even move through the ceiling. That I pray and he doesn't hear. Verses 10 through 13, he articulates another feeling. He says, he was unto me as a bear lying in wait and as a lion in secret places. He hath turned aside my ways. He pulled me in pieces. He hath made me desolate. He hath bent his bow and he set me as a mark for the arrow. He has caused the arrow of his quiver to enter into my reins. The way I described this last week is it's that feeling that sometimes we have every now and then where it feels like the Lord has, in a sense, kind of put a target on us, and we are the target of His efforts to make life difficult on our behalf. It's just a hard and it's a heavy passage. I'm not trying to make light of anything, but just trying to balance out the sorrow of this passage. I, for years, have loved Far Side and the Far Side cartoons that are out there. And one of my favorites that I have always gotten a chuckle at is the one that has the two deer looking at each other in the woods, and the one turns to the other and he has this target. And the one deer says to him, "Bummer of a birthmark, man." You know, that of all the birthmarks, he has one that looks just like a target. And the reason I highlight that is, one, to kind of pull us down just a little bit out of this, but to also remind us that's kind of what he's feeling, that he was born with a target, and when it comes to the shot to the target, it's God behind the shot. I think it's interesting. Look at verse 14. He couples this feeling with this feeling. He says, "I was a derision to all my people, and their song all the day." So he says, because I was living in such a situation where it felt like a target was on my back and God was after me, what he experienced is people saying to him in a derogatory way, "I thought you were a son of God. I thought you were a child of God, and it feels like your God is picking on you." And so it's just feeling upon feeling of sorrow and sorrow that comes his way. Verse 17 is perhaps my favorite. He says, "And thou hast removed my soul far off from peace, and I forgot prosperity." He says, this is how I'm feeling. I am feeling so low that I can't even remember what it's like to feel good. I can't remember the days in which things were going really well. And then finally in verse 20, he says, "My soul hath them still in remembrance." What's he saying there? He's saying all of these feelings were like on a loop of repeat, just over and over and over and over and over again. Last week, I experienced something I have not experienced in quite a while in preaching, but you would have noticed I ended a little bit more abruptly last week. I finished sooner than anticipated, and I did not complete last week's message. And really the large part of that was watching and observing just kind of the responses of you. That there is so many in this room who can sympathize with the sorrow of Jeremiah. And there was a tearfulness as we navigated these verses that I wanted to be really sensitive and careful about. And so I've come into today actually praying just extensively that God would give us a strength of heart and a strength of mind to make our way through this chapter, because in the middle of it, if we can navigate the Cape of Storms, you find the Cape of Good Hope. Now go back in this text, and I want you to think with me about something. I shared with you last week that in these first 18 verses, when we find ourselves feeling this way, and I use the word feeling extremely in particular, when we feel this way, it shouldn't surprise us that there's this four-word question that has a way of kind of sneaking into our mind. Okay, there's a four-word question that has a way of kind of sneaking its way into our thoughts, and it poses the question that is found in chapter 2 and verse 13. Here's the question: who can heal thee? Another way to ask that question is, where am I going to find comfort? When I feel this low, where am I going to find what I need to feel better? Jeremiah articulates it as, who can heal thee? And in your notes, there on that front page, I share this, number 2. How we answer that question determines the direction of our hope. If a person doesn't answer the question, who will heal me, correctly, they're going to find that life stays the Cape of Storm. But if we'll answer it rightly and correctly, you can find the Cape of Good Hope. Now, in chapter 1, Jeremiah alludes to the fact that they had gone to a group of people looking for the answer to their sorrow. He calls them their companions and their lovers. And when they turned to their friends and their lovers, they found that those individuals were more concerned about them feeling well than telling Israel what they needed to hear to be healed. And the result was despair. In chapter 2, he says, some of you even turned to people who carried a religious label, priests and prophets. But when you interacted with them, all they told you is what you wanted to hear and not the truth. And then once again, you found yourself in deeper despair rather than hope. There's an interesting thing. I want you to look at chapter 4. We're not there, but we'll be there next week. In chapter 4 and verse 17, he keeps this theme of looking for help. But in chapter 4, verse 17, he describes where they're at. He says, as for us, our eyes as yet failed for our vain help. In our watching, we have watched for a nation that could not save us. So he says, we actually got to a point where our tear ducts have run out of liquid. We can't cry anymore. We're at such a level of despair because we have turned to companions and lovers and found that to be empty. We turned to religious people, found that to be empty. We've even looked for it in another nation. And in all of those, we did not find healing. And his description is so interesting. He's like, we ran out of tears. That's how deep our sorrow is. So he's suggesting we turned to the wrong answers for healing, and it actually made life worse. But in chapter 1, chapter 2, and now in chapter 3, Jeremiah is suggesting this. If we will turn to the God who is sovereign over the consequences of our sin, we will find healing. I would be negligent, I believe, if I didn't pause here once again, as we did last week, and suggest to us that who we circle ourselves with when we are at our lowest is critically important. And having the kind of people around us who are more concerned with our being right with God than their comforts or our comforts are the kind of people we need in our life. The fact that in chapter 2 he says they actually went to people who carried spiritual labels is instructional for us, that I can't just take for granted that, well, I'm in a church building and anyone in this room would be a good person to circle myself with. Because it's actually possible that you and I could have individuals within this room who carry the title Christian, sister in Christ, brother in Christ, pastor, who simply tell us what we want to hear and not what we need to hear. I penned it this way years ago, and I've shared this with many through the years. All of us need that person in our life that is willing to risk the relationship for me to have a healthy relationship with God. It's the kind of person that is not loyal to maintaining the relationship. They are loyal to my having a good relationship with God. And I would suggest those are not just good friends to have. When there's a church body that thinks that way and is looking out for each other that way, we have a really, really healthy church. Now, back in our text, I think in chapter 3 and verse 20, you see a little bit of a value statement. Because, as you recall, in verse 20, he says, my soul hath them still in remembrance. He says, all these things are on a repeat loop. They're just repeating over and over. These feelings are something that he is feeling again and again and again and again. And he ties it to, I can't get these things out of my mind. I keep remembering them. I don't suspect I'm the only one, but has anyone in this room other than me ever kind of thought, or maybe articulated it to God this way, the value of having spiritual amnesia? that it would be really nice if there were just segments of life and segments of our past that we never remembered again. I mean, there's a lot of things that I have through the years kind of asked the Lord, why is it that when it comes to memorizing a verse, I can barely do it, but if you were to play a song, I can tell you who I was with, what I was doing, and everything that displeased God in that moment. And I go, Lord, I wish I had spiritual amnesia in this thing and didn't remember that. But there's a value statement here in which it indicates perhaps why God doesn't give us spiritual amnesia. He says, my soul hath them still in remembrance and is humbled in me. The fact that God does not give us these blinders to cease from seeing the despair of the world, the fact that God doesn't give us this spiritual amnesia to forget the sins we've committed and the things we have done, the consequences we have, that's God's way of keeping us humble. And I would submit that if we will humbly respond to the cape of storm, that humility is the key to it becoming the cape of good hope. So, this is an illustration. Some of you can identify with it. A few years back, I'm standing in Target. I'm in the dog food aisle, doing the most general of errands, finding dog bones. And a song came across the sound speakers of Target. And in that moment, I could tell you what it smelled like, who I was with, what was happening that night, what was said. I could give it to you in great detail simply because one song triggered the memory. And I remember standing there, it was about 8 o'clock in the evening, and kind of quietly looking around, see if anybody else was in the dog food aisle. Because for a moment, I was utterly embarrassed that that's who I used to be. And as though there was a part of me that wanted to go, Lord, I don't ever want to remember any of that stuff. You forgave me of that stuff. That was your mercy. He allows us to remember those things for the sake of that humility that says, you're not everything you think you are. You needed God then, you need God today. And by the way, the same God who was merciful to you then is merciful to you today. And so in a way, I think there's a spiritual maturity that is in our lives when we begin to thank God for the memories, even as hard as they sometimes are, if we will respond humbly to them. In Lamentations 3:17 through 21, we really begin to see what I would call the fruit of that humility. There's some things that begin to blossom. There are some things that begin to come out. We looked at it this way last week. I put it there on the front flyleaf of this outline. In verses 17 through 21, you'll notice that I highlighted it with the bold black lettering. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, my endurance has perished. So has my hope from the Lord. Remember mine affliction, my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. When you look at those words that are underscored or bolded in black lettering, what you see there is an emphasis on the mind. He's emphasizing here that in the midst of this despair, in the midst of this hopelessness, what was going to turn this in a positive direction was how Jeremiah thought. And in that little box to your left, I gave you this counseling phrase last week, and I want to say it again. Some of you have heard me say this, where we've just been sitting together and we're talking through something, and I'll say this: we need to outthink our feelings. In a sense, that's what Jeremiah is saying he did. Verses 1 through 17, his feelings are all over the map, and they're on a loop of repeat. But he says, if I'm going to find hope, if I'm going to get victory here, I've got to outthink my feelings. He says in verse 19, remembering my affliction, my wanderings, my soul continually remembers. Those seem to be things that happen naturally. In other words, I don't have to force myself to think about the hard things in life. My brain does a really good job on its own in that regard. But in verse 21, here's the way I like to describe it. In verse 21, he puts the work gloves on. So I'm going to put the work gloves on, and I'm going to go to work at recalling to my mind something different. So if you and I are going to outthink our feelings, we have to reach into the toolbox, grab the work gloves, put them on, and do the work of thinking a different way. And if you'll flip the page, this is where we find the instruction on how to think. In verse 21, he says, this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. And he begins with this first thing, which is the steadfast love of the Lord. He then goes on in verse 22 to describe a second thing, which is his mercies never come to an end. He characterizes both of these with the phrase, great is your faithfulness. And then he says, the Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good. Verse 26, it is good. Verse 27, it is good for a man. And I want to remind us of one of the structural lessons of these verses. In verses 22 and 23, he is focused on who God is. And he shifts from that to a conclusion about what God has done, saying things like, well, God has been good. So let me say it again so that we capture the structural lesson. He starts by recalling to mind who God is, and there's a shift in which he starts now articulating what God has done. And I think there's a structural lesson that if today you're trying to make sense of what God has done, you'll never be able to make sense of it unless you start with who he is. So to the person today who is weighed down by what God is doing in your life and you're trying to figure out the what, start with who he is, because until we know who he is, we'll never make sense of what he's doing in our life. And I would submit that by the testimony of Jeremiah, when we start with the who, we might actually find our conclusion about what God is doing in our life, even as hard as it is. It's actually really, really good. In verse 22, the first thing he focuses on is the love of the Lord. It's this Hebrew word that we don't use, but you've perhaps heard of it. It's hesed. It is a word that is kind of made up of different pieces. So there in your notes, let me give you, in my estimation, what are the three key pieces to this steadfast love of the Lord. They're really easy to remember because they all start with L, and that's just for my sake that I can remember them. But in that first blank, let's go ahead and put the word love, because there's no getting around that this is a word and a phrase that indicates a particular kind of love of God. In the second blank, let's put the word length. Okay, length. That he's indicating here that it's a love that has a long run to it. It has a long distance to it. And then thirdly, in that blank, let's put the word loyalty. Loyalty. So if we were to take the steadfast, hesed, love of God and put it under a microscope and zero in, we would see three things swimming around. We would see the love of God, an indicator to the length of God's love, and an indicator to the loyalty of God's love. In that next blank there, which is number 2, I want you to put a word that I think is really, really key here. It's the word volitional. Volitional. Because for him to use the concept of God's steadfast love, this is a love that doesn't feel, it's a love that chooses. It's the kind of love that though I may be a mess, he chooses to love me. And that's really important as we look at the second characteristic he deals with. But God's love, his steadfast love, is volitional. He didn't wake up one morning feeling love towards me. He woke up choosing to love me, is the idea. Next to that idea of length, let me just make 2 little side comments that I think are really helpful for us to bring this alive. I think it is neat that even before Ron Perry ever realized that God loves me, God already loved me. It wasn't that God came to a place of loving me and shortly after I discovered it too. He loved me before I ever knew he loved me. And when I think about it that way, please capture this for a second to anyone with a heavy heart today. If God loved me before I knew it, he'll also love me after when I'm doubting it. That's his length of love. I love what one author said about the steadfast love of the Lord. It said, he said that the steadfast love of the Lord is like a good worker. Shows up early and doesn't finish until the job is done. And that's the kind of love that God has for you and for me. Jeremiah says that in my hopelessness and in the world of feelings, he put on the work gloves and he pushed to the forefront of his mind the steadfast love of the Lord. Number 2, he says this in the end of verse 22, his mercies. I appreciate what a few translations have in which they translate it his compassions. And I actually think that is a helpful interpretation of the word that is used there. For years, I've defined compassion as a passionate concern that drives one to action. The reason I like that is that God does not just feel towards me, he feels towards me and then does something about it. That's really the joy of this word. I think all of us in this room are really thankful that we have a God who both feels our sorrow, feels our pain, feels our difficulty, but doesn't just stand there or sit there and do nothing about it. He acts upon what he knows and feels on our behalf. So back in that first reference to the love of God, I encourage you to write the word volitional. Remember that? There's a contrast here because this word for compassion is not emphasizing the volition or the choice of God. It's actually a word that is used elsewhere in the Old Testament to speak of the motherly nature of a mom for her child. So there in your notes, number 2, underneath the compassion of God, let's put the word maternal. Because if the first one he's drawing to his mind is the volitional love of God, what he's now also drawing to mind is this maternal, motherly nature of God to love us and to feel towards us. When it comes to this, I just think it's kind of neat. Have you ever heard or seen it said of some that kid is the kind of kid only a mother could love? You ever heard that or thought that about somebody you saw run by you in a store? All right. We're highlighting that moms just have a very, very unique love. And it's God's way of saying there is a part of him that as crazy as we are, sinful as we are, as messy as we are, he feels a love towards us like a parent does. We are his. I don't mean to draw our attention to a wrong place, but in our home, if the girls were ever sick to their stomach, Benneth was the first responder. I don't know what it is, but God has wired her to be able to handle some of the messes of children, that if it was me, I walked in with either the diaper or what was, exploded. I responded with dry heaves and gasp. And she, without mask, without hazmat suit, could walk in and deal with it. And I'm not telling you I made that up so that I could get out of stuff. It really just is the way some men are made. And I look at this and I go, what a wonderful way of describing our God in a text like this, that he does not become repulsive to what he sees in us. He moves forward with love. That's what he's highlighting there. Now, some have suggested that at the end of verse 23, the great is your faithfulness is a third qualification or characteristic that Jeremiah is recalling. And the reason I put it in red there for us in our notes is because I think what he's doing there, that is the exclamation about the characteristics that are assigned to these things. So look at the characteristics that are assigned to his love and compassion. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies, they never come to an end. He's never going to run out of this. And by the way, in verse 23, they are new every morning. And again, I go back to the helpfulness of both G. Campbell Morgan, D. Martin Lloyd-Jones, that word new is a creative word. That it's not just that God will never run out of these things. He creatively manifests or displays these things on a fresh basis every day. And to those characteristics, Jeremiah is saying, wow, great is a faithful God like that. The faithfulness is tied to the never ending of these things. I don't know if this helps you, but in my study of these verses, in an attempt to just put it on the bottom shelf for my thinking when I'm in a low place, I like to think of it this way, that God's steadfast love and his compassion means two things. He will never run out of what I need. And he will, number two, never retreat from what he sees. Some of you are in a camp setting and you're in a place where there's buffets. Since 2020, buffets are kind of limited, and so this illustration isn't as pertinent as it used to be. But have you guys ever been at a buffet and you look ahead of you and you've got half of a line of football players in front of you? They're all big boys. And you're looking at the buffet and what's being displayed, and you're like, by the time I get up there, there's going to be nothing left. And sometimes we can think, when we live in a world of great sorrow and sin, that there's a point in time where God will run out of mercy. But his buffet of mercy is unending, and it'll never run out. To the person today who is just weighted down by the fact that you've been asking God's forgiveness for the same sin for 1,000 times, God did not run out of mercy on 999. He will have mercy for the 1,000th, the 2,000th, the 3,000th. And not only that, he will be a God who is maternal in his feelings towards us. He's not repulsed by it. He doesn't run from it. In both of these things, we see a God who moves toward us in our hopelessness. Now, I don't know if you've thought about this, but I want you to think about it just for a second. Of all the things that Jeremiah could have brought to his mind, why did he just bring these two? So just think on that just for a second, and let me see if I can give you a possible answer. He could have said, I recall to my mind the wisdom of God, the sovereignty of God, the righteousness of God, justice of God, kindness of God, grace of God. There's all of these different characteristics and attributes. but yet he boils it down to this steadfast, unending, loyal love of God. And then number two, this maternal love that God has for us. And I would actually suggest that the reason it is zeroed in on these two is because what we see here is a pattern that you actually see elsewhere in the Bible. There is a logic to the insertion of these two things. There's a logic that the Apostle Paul is going to lean in on a number of times, in which he is suggesting that if a God is this way in this, you can certainly expect him to be this way here. So follow the logic here, and I'll show you in the New Testament where the same logic is. If you and I have a God who in our sin, and in all of the consequences to our sin, chooses with loyalty to move towards us and grant to us mercy. Forgive us of those sins. Don't you think a God like that will also care for you in the hard things of life where you need the maternal love and care of God? That's the logic here. So hold your finger here. Let me show you the logic that Paul uses. It's in Romans chapter 8, which is one of our favorite chapters in the book of Romans. Romans chapter 8 and verse 32. Paul throws the same logic, and this isn't the only time it happens. He says this in verse 32 of Romans 8. He that spared not his own son, but delivered him up for us all. He saw us in our sin. He sent a solution for us. How shall he not with him also freely give us all things? His logic is, if the Lord would come and save you when you are at your worst, don't you also think he'll come and help you in all the other seasons of life? Sometimes when I am preaching and I look over my notes, there are certain things that I actually pray that, like, the Lord would help us understand. There are things in my outline in which I ask the Lord for me to be clear. And there are even times in an outline in which I say, Lord, if they don't get anything else, help them remember this. And this morning, I was praying, Lord, if everyone slept through the first 25 minutes of this and they just woke up for a mere second and this is all that they got, would you help them get this? Here it is. And with an interest like that, I hope I woke you up. And you can go to sleep after this, if you'll just remember this, that I believe the logical flow that Jeremiah is directing his thinking goes like this. If God did not turn from me when I was at my worst, he certainly won't turn from me when I'm at my lowest. That's the logic of thought. He is starting at God in his mercy to him as a sinner and moving to this maternal love for God in all provisions of life. He says, if he is saying it this way, if God did not turn from me at my worst, he will not turn from me at my lowest. And here's where it gets really hard. Okay, this is what I would call counseling hardship. Let's say that someone is sitting in front of me and they are in this spiral of low feelings. I mean, their feelings are all over the map. And I say, listen, you're going to have to outthink your feelings here for a moment. And they say, well, where do I start? I believe Jeremiah would suggest, why don't you start when you were at your worst? When God found you and poured out his unending mercies on your life. Start there. And when we begin to realize that God, in my worst, moved towards me, sent His Son to die for me, offered to me mercy, clears accounts, forgives, gives new life. A God like that is not going to turn and run away from me when I'm having a rough day. And it pulls us up out of this spiral of despair. So homework for us, if you're in this spiral of feelings, would you go back to the day you got saved? How did the Lord find you when you were at your worst? And a God who will find you there is a God who will stick with you when you're low. Does that make sense? Now, if we can start there, we can start to process life. Things like Jeremiah is saying in verse 24, "The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in Him." He says, because of these things that I know about the Lord, he says, what I am finding is, and here's how you can fill it in, the Lord is my everything. That's the everyday language for what he says when he goes, the Lord is my portion. He's saying, the Lord is my everything. And last week I gave you a little catchphrase, and I told you if you couldn't remember anything else, remember this. So if you didn't catch it last week, you get to catch it this week. To the person who recognizes that the Lord is their everything has the ability to face anything. And he is coming to a place where though he has lost much, that's chapter 1 of Lamentations, and many other people have lost much, that's chapter 2. God is still his everything. And one of the things I found in my life is I can tell whether or not I truly believe that God is my everything by how I respond when I lose something. And when we lose something, how we respond determines whether or not I really believe He is my everything or not. And Jeremiah goes, He is my portion. And because of that, I can say something. He says my soul. I liked what one author said about verse 24. He said, sometimes when we get a truth about God, it gives our soul a voice. His soul comes alive with a voice. He says, I will hope in Him. In verse 25, he comes to another conclusion. The Lord is good. Verse 25, his conclusion is that the Lord is good. But there's a caveat. He is good to those who have chosen to respond to Him the right way, to those who are willing to wait on Him. Verse 26, he has another conclusion. It is good that I should be in a place of complete trust in God. He echoes the similar thing in verse 27, saying, I actually look back on my past now and realize it was good even when I was younger to go through some of these things to realize God's goodness. The conclusions follow the revelations. He sees God in His mercy and His steadfast love, and he comes to some conclusions. Does that make sense? Now let's circle the airport one time and land the plane. Okay? Would you note with me something that I think is kind of interesting in verse 28? It's the last verse on the insert there. Let him sit alone in silence when it is laid on him. There's a shift in chapter 3 that happens with this little statement. And I would actually submit that moving forward in chapter 3, you hear this sound of worship starting to manifest. There's some worshipful thoughts that start to emerge in chapter 3, but it all begins with sitting in silence. And I found this to be kind of thought-provoking, that sometimes we think of worship as being music and energy and the waving of hands and the delights of the eyes. Here he articulates that worship for him started to come in the form of silence. But it was in that silence that some very important things started to happen. For instance, like in verse 29, he says, "He putteth his mouth in the dust, if so be there may be hope." His worship here starts to manifest itself in a submission. There's a poetic way of saying submission by saying he found himself at the lowest place in the dirt. So as he began to realize who God was and make sense of what God was doing, it produces this silent worship that produces this submission into the dust. It's followed in verse 40 with another worshipful phrase in which he says, "Let us search and try our ways and turn again to the Lord." He says it's in that place of submission that I'm going to start to do some introspection, and I'm going to search my own heart. I'm going to see if there be any wicked way in me. And then in verse 55, you see your final worship phrase, "I called upon thy name, O Lord, out of the low dungeon, and thou hast heard my voice." He starts to cry and move to the Lord. In essence, what he's doing, he's answering the question, who can heal us the right way? And God gets him to that place. So just because a person says, "I will recall these things to my mind," that's not the end of the train. Recalling these things to mind is what produces this ability to process what God is doing. And the better I understand what God is doing, the more silent I become. And in that silence, we submit. And in that submission, we begin to examine our hearts. And in that silence, we turn to the Lord. And that's the person that finds hope. Let me conclude this way. There is a structural lesson in Lamentations 3. Because if you were to take the first half, verses 1 through 17, and overlay them on the second half of Lamentations 3, you actually see some parallels. You see some things that almost sound familiar. And there's a structural lesson that the beginning of this chapter, Jeremiah's got all these feelings. They're all over the place. But then he recalls to mind, he starts to have hope, and the chapter ends with some of those feelings coming back. And he's going, I'm right back where I started. And I want you to listen. The structural lesson there is this. Just because I thought right yesterday doesn't mean I won't feel the same today. And just because I thought right a week ago doesn't guarantee I'll think right a week from now. Feelings come and go. And if we're going to navigate with people who are people of hope, this recalling to mind has to be a way of life. And one of the things that I find so often is people think, well, if I can just think right today, life changes. You and I might think right today and life stays the exact same. I might think right today and feel a little better, but wake up tomorrow feeling the same way I did yesterday. And I'll have to put the work gloves back on and recall to hope and to mind these truths. Does that make sense? Is there anybody else in the room who feels like lights are coming on of understanding going, I'm getting it. This is the way we live. This is how we have hope. And may God help us with that. Heavenly Father, I pray that today you would help us to be people who are people of hope, because we have recalled to mind these particular truths about God. There may be some in this room who are trying to process what you're doing in their life without meditating on who you are. May you push us to think more about who you are than what you're doing. Lord, I pray today that to anyone who is in the roller coaster of despair, would you help them move towards the cross? to the worst time in their life where your mercy was abundantly shed on them. And would you help us each to just conclude that a God who moved towards us when we were at our worst will certainly be faithful to us when we are at our lowest. Lord, we need that truth. This world needs people of hope. And I pray that you would help us be those people. In your precious name. And together we said, Amen.